Welcome to General Chemistry 1 in this summer 2020 session. Hopefully over the next 6 weeks we'll have an opportunity to get to know each other and spend some good time together exploring the properties of matter and exploring this field that we call chemistry. So to begin, you might have a couple questions. You might wonder first, what is chemistry? And you might also wonder why we should study chemistry. Now, some of you are here taking this course as a general science elective. Others, this is a required course as a part of your major. And regardless of what position you're in, the question may still be there. You may still wonder, even if this is a required course for your major, you might wonder, what exactly is chemistry? And even you may also wonder, why study chemistry? If you're an electrical engineering major, why do you need chemistry? And so those are the questions that may start as we very begin this process. And we can answer them in a couple of different ways. First of all, what is chemistry? At its very fundamental level, chemistry is the study of matter, the properties of matter, and the changes that matter undergoes. Now, why should we study chemistry? Well, there's a whole large number of reasons why we should study chemistry, but it all comes down to the fact that chemistry underpins our daily lives. And just even a basic understanding of it can have broad practical applications. Here's just a few examples of how chemistry is pervasive over everything. So there's in the fields of energy, solar panels involve chemistry at a very fundamental level. It's the way that electricity is generated. Biochemistry, whether it's why the sky is blue or why a plant is green or why we get the flash of light from a firefly, that comes down to chemistry, chemical reactions, and the properties of chemicals. For light technology, whether it's incandescent bulbs, whether it's fluorescent bulbs in a room, that involves basic photochemistry, or LEDs, light emitting diodes, that involves basic photochemistry of some elements. Also medicine, all sorts of chemical applications in medicine, whether it's simply solution concentration or dosage amounts, or it could be simply the plastic tubing that is used all over medical applications. That is formed from polymers, which are a chemical that are made generally industrially. So in all these cases and many, many more, dish soap, laundry, cleaning applications, all of those things are underpinned by basic chemical processes, and it's really helpful to know something about those. So to give one more practical application of kind of the importance of chemistry, here just shows some cartoon examples of some molecules. Now we'll go into more detail on this later, but each ball here represents an element. So red is oxygen, black is carbon, white is hydrogen. Again, we'll talk about this more detail later. But you can see some fairly familiar molecules: oxygen, that's in the air we breathe, water, carbon dioxide, all those are familiar. Aspirin here on the right that we might take for a headache. In the center, though, I want to highlight two molecules. There's ethanol, and below it, ethylene glycol. Now, you can see there's a very minor difference between the two molecules. The only difference is in ethylene glycol, we have one more oxygen atom in red. That's honestly the only difference between the two molecules. Ethanol is the main component of alcoholic beverages. It's the alcohol in alcoholic beverages, anything from beer to wine or other spirits. And so we readily consume ethanol on large scale throughout the United States and the world. And at relatively low levels, or at least at not terribly high levels, ethanol is not toxic. Ethylene glycol, on the other hand, is the main component of car antifreeze and is very toxic. So even ingesting a small amount of this would be very bad for you. Over a lifetime, we can ingest large amounts of ethanol, hopefully not all at once, and suffer essentially no bodily damage, whereas ethylene glycol would do significant damage at even small consumptions. The main point being here that even minor differences in structure can result in major differences in properties. This is another reason why it's important to study chemistry, so that we can know more about just these minor differences can have major impacts on everyday life. And that's important for us to know. So we've talked about why study chemistry. We've talked about what chemistry is, but then the next question might be, how do we study chemistry? We approach chemistry the same way we approach anything from a scientific perspective, and that's using the scientific method. That can be shown here in a couple of different ways. You may or may not be already familiar with the scientific method. But it starts essentially with an observation. You see something, whether it's in nature or in the lab or just in society, and it leads you then to a question. Why did that happen? Or why does this look the way that it is? And that question then leads you to formulate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an educated guess as to explain the observation. And then the scientific method takes that guess further. It doesn't say, okay, that guess is good, takes it and says, all right, let's design an experiment now to test our hypothesis, or experiments. Now, this doesn't have to be in the lab. It can be in social sciences. It can be a survey to test your hypothesis of some social behavior. Or it could be in the lab where we design experiments to test some physical phenomena. After you've done those experiments, you then analyze the results that you got back and draw some conclusion from that. Does your hypothesis actually explain the results and explain the observation? So is your hypothesis verified or is it not? And then this can be an iterative process. If the results come back and say, no, your hypothesis is not matched, then we have to design a new hypothesis, and we kind of continue this process. Even if your hypothesis is validated by the results, it's not completely, it's only supported, we would say, by the results. It's not nailed down saying, oh, this is exactly what happens. It's possible there could be another explanation. And so that's where we often need additional experiments to prove or provide more support for one hypothesis over others. And that's sort of what's shown on the right here, where just another way of going through the scientific method and also explaining how we get things like theories and scientific laws. So you go through the normal process, you test your hypothesis, but then after your hypothesis has been tested multiple times with experiments, then if this is for maybe a larger physical phenomena, you would then formulate a theory that is essentially just the explanation of all of the experiments as a more concrete hypothesis. That theory then needs to be tested repeatedly over time before it could eventually become something like a scientific law. So an example of this might be something like the hypothesis of gravity, that there's some force that pulls objects towards the Earth or towards a large object. And then that's tested multiple times through experiments, formulate a theory of gravity, and then it's additional times, additional cases where we would test that theory before we would say whether it becomes a law or not. So we sometimes, perhaps mistakenly, talk about the law of gravity. Now that we've explored things further, we might be able to say, oh, gravity doesn't actually exist in the way that it was originally formulated. But it does work for us on most everyday scales, as long as we're not talking about ginormous astronomical bodies or extremely small particles. So there, we've talked about what chemistry is, why we should study it, and a little bit about how we do this. And we'll apply these methods as we go forward in this course.